My mother died back in 1991. My brother Eddie was 8 and I was 6 when our mother died in a terrible accident in our own house. From what we could gather, she had been running down the upstairs hallway with a knife when she slipped and tumbled down the stairs, the knife lodging itself in her chest before she landed in a crumpled heap at the bottom. Though it was considered a taboo subject for obvious reasons, I sometimes found myself wondering why she had been running down the upstairs hallway, and especially why she had had a knife with her. Although if the weeks leading up to her death were any indication, the answers I wanted were closer to home than I could have ever thought. You see, my mother thought that the house was haunted. Always had. The first day Dad drove her up to it on a crisp autumn day, she had a bad feeling about it. But I guess her love for him was stronger than her fear because she lived in that place for 12 years before her accident. Eddie has more vivid memories of her than I, but I do remember one incident in particular. It was somewhere around 2 in the morning when I woke up, wanting a glass of water. When I walked out into the hallway, I had been shocked to see my mother sitting on the top of the stairs, her back to the wall, tears streaming down her cheeks. She turned over and saw me before getting up and walking over. Nate, sweetie, do you hear that?" I remember her asking, looking around the dark hallway as she did. "Who, Mommy?" I asked tiredly, really just wanting to get the water and get back to bed. That voice coming from the wall," she whispered, then going silent as if to emphasize her point. I, of course, could hear nothing, but to just get the whole ordeal over with, I said that I did. Her demeanor seemed to grow in both excitement and fear at my words. "Go back to bed, sweetie, I'll see you in the morning." I started to protest, but she gave me a quick kiss on the cheek and scooted me back to my room. When I got up the next morning and made my way downstairs, I saw that there was a rough hole in the wall near the top of the stairs. When I got home from school that day, there was a picture of my father hanging in that same place. I told Eddie about the incident, but he didn't seem to believe me. My mother's paranoia grew over the next few weeks. Nighttime walks through the house became an everyday occurrence. More and more pictures were being hung on the walls, and she never slept more than 3 hours at a time. I remember the night before she died vividly. I was half asleep in my bed when I heard the sound of breaking glass followed by a loud scream coming from downstairs. I quickly jumped out of the bed and made my way downstairs, only to find my mother swinging a knife wildly in the air, occasionally stabbing into the wall. "Get out!" she was screaming as the strokes became more frantic. "Get out of my house!" I started to walk towards her, but I was thrown to the side by my father, who almost tackled her and wrestled the knife out of her hand. She was sobbing on the floor, yelling about something that had come out of the wall. Looking up, I saw a huge hole in the plaster, about the size of a basketball, surrounded by the crisscross slashes of the knife. My father managed to calmly walk her back upstairs into her bed, where she eventually fell asleep. The next day, before leaving for work and taking Eddie and I to school, he told her to stay in bed with a hot water bottle on her head. She reluctantly agreed and we left. She was dead by that afternoon, when we all returned home. Despite the terrible accident that had occurred there, my father remained in the house until his death about 6 months ago from an illness. Even though he stopped living there about a year before he died, he continued to claim ownership. I couldn't blame him. It was a beautiful thing. 2 stories of red brick with a gabled roof and warm lighted windows in almost every room. It was in a prime location too, just about 10 minutes from down by the way of a road that led through a beautiful forest. It sat on a sort of a hill, allowing the forest to slope down in front of it before breaking off into town. The view of the sunrise was absolutely breathtaking from the living room window. If one were to sell it now, you could easily get $800,000 for it. I was surprised when my father's will left the place to me. It had been Eddie who stayed in the house, taking care of him as his health deteriorated. Eddie wasn't too happy about it either, and I could tell. I didn't know if I even wanted it, to be honest. I had a bad memory of the place, forever staining it in my mind, but I couldn't just sell it or give it to Eddie. It had been my father's house for almost 40 years, and letting such an integral piece of family history go seemed wrong, on some level. So I moved in. Dad had left most of the furniture intact, so all I needed were my clothes, a few extra pieces, and some stuff of my own. As I walked into the front hall the first day, I found my eyes drawn to the bottom of the stairs. The wood had been replaced on the last few steps. A large painting of a mist-covered mountain hung on the wall where I knew the largest hole had been. I spent most of the rest of the day unpacking and getting myself mentally prepared to live there. I'd already done the hard things like moving the non-essential items into a storage unit and giving house keys to family members and a few selected friends. I strolled through the rooms as the sun sank low in the sky, going back through old memories of my 18 years spent living there. Those pictures that Mom had hung up still silently watched as I walked past. After a quick dinner, I made my way upstairs to my old bedroom, which had been converted into a guest room, and I slept there until I could make it my own. Something woke me up in the middle of the night. My eyes just seemed to snap open and the sound floated in from the crack in the door. It was low and barely audible. It was a soft mumbling sound. My eyes grew wide and I found myself drawn back to that night 26 years before when I saw my mother at the top of the stairs. The mumbling seemed to grow in volume, although what it was saying didn't get any clearer. As I sat up in bed, it reached a new intensity, until it seemed to be rattling my bones. It sounded like something screaming through a gag. I got up as quickly as I could and flung open the door to the hallway. As soon as it had started, it silenced like someone had flicked a switch. There was nothing there but darkness and gloom. I ended up passing the whole incident off as a bad dream. I had been alone in the house and I was sure of that. I had checked every door to make sure it was locked before going to bed that night. I had Eddie over for dinner a few nights later. We spent most of the time reminiscing about Mom and Dad and how little the house had changed over the years. "Are you happy here, man?" he asked as he cut into his steak. "Yeah, I guess so. I mean, it's kinda lonely up here, but I can see why Dad never left it until he had to. It's a beautiful place, isn't it? There's so many memories here, good and..." He trailed off as he looked over his shoulder, through the living room and towards the staircase. "Bad," he concluded somberly before taking another bite. As I was washing the dishes, he excluded himself to use the bathroom. I told him the toilet was clogged in the downstairs one, and I told him to go upstairs. Just as I was finished drying, he came back, looking a little shaken. "You didn't tell me you had a friend over, man." I froze, almost dropping the dish in my hands. "Huh?" Well, after I was done, I walked past Mom and Dad's old bedroom and saw someone lying in the bed. "Is it anyone I know?" I stammered, not wanting to make a scene. I was sure he was just mistaken. "Yeah, it's a friend from work. He came over to help paint and just got a little tired." He seemed to buy the explanation, and we talked for a little while longer before we said our goodbyes. As I closed the door behind him, I quietly made my way up the stairs and towards the bedroom door. Taking a deep breath, and I flung it open. The bed was perfectly smooth and intact. The pillows propped up and the sheets perfectly straight. Looking at the bed the way it was now, there is no way Eddie could have been mistaken. I shuddered and closed the door to the room. It was at the point I began to question the validity of all my mother's claims. Though I had never experienced anything supernatural in the house during my youth, I was quickly running out of explanations for the things that kept occurring after the bedroom incident. Doors would close and open when I hadn't been near them. Things would go missing, only to turn up days later in completely different places. The house at night was continually assaulted by strange noises that I couldn't identify. Then, one night a few weeks after that, I had the biggest experience up to that point. As you could probably guess, I wasn't exactly sleeping well at the time. I had taken up a habit of staying up until 2 a.m. watching TV in my room. But that night, however, I had the fortune of falling asleep sometime around 10 p.m. The TV had shut off due to the timer that I had set, and I was dozing peacefully when a noise started up somewhere deep within the house. This time, however, it was clear as day what the voice was saying. It seemed to repeat endlessly, over and over. "Can you hear him? Can you hear him? Can you hear him?" I sat bolt upright in bed and listened as the strange sentence continued to be announced. Getting up out of bed, I grabbed a flashlight off of my nightstand and made my way out into the hallway. A strange blue light was echoing up the stairwell, giving everything a sickly wash. Shivering, I made my way to the top of the stairs and peered over the railing. The TV in the living room was on, only it was a burst of blue static. Random lines traveling across the screen at breakneck speeds, and issuing from the speakers was that same sentence. "Can you hear him? Can you hear him? Can you hear him?" My blood ran cold when I recognized the voice. It was my mother's. Only it had a strange quality to it. Each word had a different pitch and inflection, like each one had been recorded separately at different times. It gave the whole thing a tilted and unnatural quality. I quickly shut off the TV and searched around with the beam of my flashlight for whatever could have caused it to turn on by itself. Much less would have made it say that sentence. As my beam traveled around the room, I settled on the spot on the wall with a hole in it. A large, basketball-sized hole with slash marks around it. Swinging the beam wildly again, I saw that the painting that was used for covering it was now leaning against the wall beneath it. After calming myself down, I carefully hung the painting back up in place and searched for the source of the message. I found a DVD inserted into the drive which hadn't been there the night previously. I broke it into pieces and threw them out before going back upstairs and hanging my head in my hands. Who or what was doing this to me, and why? The next day was bleak and overcast. The sky was a hazy shade of gray. I went over the events of the previous night in my head and I couldn't find an explanation for them. This thought was made all the worse by the following one, which immediately thought of my mother and how what had happened to her was now happening to me. I was well on my breaking point, to be sure, but I thought I should stick it out. I decided what I needed at that moment was someone to talk to, so I called Eddie. I explained everything that had happened last night, and he seemed worried. "And you have no idea who's doing these things. Surely you're not sane." But I cut him off, saying I didn't want to even entertain the idea. We talked for a while longer before I hung up. I spent the rest of the day mostly moping around the house, watching TV and not doing much else. Every sound the house made, every skitter, every settle, made me jump. I don't know what time I fell asleep on the couch in the living room, but when I did, it was deep and I didn't dream. The creaking of the stairs woke me up. My eyes shot open, but I could see nothing but pitch darkness. I strained my ears to listen and instantly regretted it when the sound continued. For the next 2 minutes I stood perfectly still as I heard the creak of the stairs, followed by a thumping noise as if something was being dragged up. Then, just as suddenly as they started, they stopped. I laid in the dark for minutes, trying to figure out what was going on. All that was shattered by a loud crashing noise. I sat upright and fumbled for my phone, pulling up the flashlight app and pointing the beam down at the ground. The picture of my father that I had hung up where the hole had appeared was lying in a broken heap on the living room carpet. I knew the only place it could have come from was the landing above. Although I didn't want to, I did. I slowly tracked the light up until it was shining straight on it. It was hanging halfway over the railing, arms dangling down, limp and motionless. It wore all black, which seemed to suck the beam in until I could see very little of it. Before I could even blink, its head snapped, revealing a gaunt, white face with black pits for eyes. That was all it took. I jumped off the couch and raced into the kitchen, knocking things over as I searched for my car keys. Above me, I could hear the creaks of the stairs again. I finally found them next to the sink and raced out the garage door, jumping into my car and gunning it backwards, waiting just enough time for the door to go up. As I shot down the driveway and turned around, I looked back to see the house, near the dark, the face staring at me from the living room window. As I sped down the forest road, I nearly sideswiped a red car that was parked about a foot off the path. As I put more distance between myself and the house, rational thought returned to me. I remember the events of the past few weeks and found myself pulling the car to a stop. Eddie had claimed that he saw someone laying in the bed, but when I checked, it showed no signs of being slept in. The DVD in the player was just one you could buy in any store. It was not something that could just play my mother's voice without any programming. He had access to our old home movies and could have easily edited the footage together. And as far as I knew, only Eddie, Dad, and I knew about my mother's claims of the supernatural. The final puzzle pieces clicked into place when I remembered two facts. Eddie had wanted the house. His jealousy had been clear at the readings of my father's will. Also, I would recognize the red car parked in the forest anywhere. Eddie had bought it when he was 16 and kept it all these years. After turning around and heading up the road back towards the house, I was fuming. Eddie was behind all of this, I was sure of it. He was surely to be delusional for going to this much trouble just to drive me out of the house. And for what? So he could live in it? So he could sell it? I'd never really wanted the house in the first place. I would have given it to him at the drop of the hat. I could see the house now, and it was only a few 100 feet away. I was brought back out of my trance by the sight of Eddie running full force down the forest road towards his car. I cursed and swerved to avoid him just as he reached his car. Something in his hand slipped out and landed on the path as he climbed in just as I was climbing out. Before I could even yell, he was shooting down the road at a record speed until he was out of sight. I was now more confused than angry. Why had Eddie run from the house? He had gotten what he wanted. He had made me leave. All of that was shattered when I picked up the thing that he had dropped in his haste. It was a mask, but it wasn't the one that I had expected. It looked like a generic, rotting corpse one you could buy at any Halloween store. Realization swept over me like a wave. Looking up, I was just in time to see the dark shape slip back into the house. A small, white face appeared behind the crack in the door. Then it slammed with a resounding crash.